The stallion reared back, hooves slashing air, and Margaret Whitmore didn't flinch. While men scattered from the corral fence, the woman Red Hollow had dismissed for 38 years stood her ground. The black horse, the one that had hospitalized 2 ranch hands and cost Ethan Mercer everything, went still beneath her outstretched hand. In that frozen moment, the cowboy who'd been forced to marry her out of desperation realized something the entire town had missed. The woman they'd pitied was the only person who could save him. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The mud outside Red Hollow's Methodist Church had frozen into ruts by the time Margaret Whitmore emerged into February sunlight. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter and watched the Hendersons climb into their wagon, 3 children bundled like packages. Mrs. Henderson pregnant again. Mr. Henderson's hand resting on his wife's back with casual ownership. Margaret looked away. She'd stopped counting the Sundays, stopped marking the years. At 38, she'd become part of the landscape, noticed only when absent, like a missing fence post. "Miss Whitmore!" Sarah Chen ran up, boots splashing through half-melted ice. "I finished the McGuffey reader you lent me. All of it." Margaret smiled despite the cold gnawing her fingers. "The whole 3rd reader? Sarah, that's wonderful. Mama says I read better than my brother now." The girl beamed. "He's 13, and I'm only 9. "Reading isn't a race, sweetheart. But it's better to win anyway," Sarah's mother called from their wagon. The girl squeezed Margaret's hand once before running off. Margaret stood alone in the churchyard while families dispersed around her like water around a stone. She'd taught most of these children, watched them grow, watched them marry, and have children of their own while she remained exactly where she'd always been, teaching, alone, invisible. "Margaret," Reverend Potter appeared at her elbow, his wife trailing behind him. "Fine sermon today, wouldn't you say? Very moving." "We were wondering," Mrs. Potter interjected with the kind of forced cheerfulness that preceded pity. "If you'd join us for Sunday dinner, it's just us and the Cranstons." Margaret had met the Cranstons. New to Red Hollow, they ran the feed store and had an unmarried son with a wandering eye and breath that smelled like whiskey-soaked tobacco. "That's kind of you, but I have papers to grade." Mrs. Potter's smile thinned. "You work too hard, dear. A woman needs—" "I appreciate the thought." Margaret turned before the sentence could finish. She'd heard every variation. A woman needs a husband. A woman needs children. A woman needs to stop being so particular. She walked home through streets she'd memorized across 2 decades, past the general store where Mr. Patterson had once courted her before deciding she was too serious, past the saloon where cowboys barely glanced her direction, past the boarding house where 3 younger women had arrived last spring and been engaged by summer. Her rented room above the milliner's shop was cold and spare. 1 narrow bed, a washstand, shelves crammed with books she'd ordered from catalogs because Red Hollow's lending library consisted of 12 volumes and a Bible with water damage. Margaret lit the stove and sat at her desk while ice formed on the inside of her window. She pulled out her students' arithmetic homework and tried to focus, but the numbers blurred. She'd stopped pretending this was temporary somewhere around her 25th birthday. Stopped imagining some distant future where things would be different. This was her life, teaching other people's children, reading other people's stories, watching other people live. The knock on her door came just after dark. Margaret opened it to find Emma Dorset, the mayor's wife, wrapped in expensive furs that made her look like an overfed marten. "Margaret, I'm sorry to disturb you." No, she wasn't. Emma Dorset had never apologized for anything in her comfortable life. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Dorset?" "May I come in? It's rather delicate." Margaret stepped aside. Emma entered with the cautious air of someone inspecting a suspect property, her gaze sweeping across Margaret's threadbare furniture and modest belongings. "Tea?" Margaret offered. "No, thank you. I won't take much of your time." Emma settled into the only chair besides the desk stool. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Charles Whitfield." Margaret knew the name. Everyone in Wyoming Territory knew the name. Whitfield owned half of Cheyenne and had his fingers in cattle, railroads, and banking. Men like that didn't concern themselves with school teachers. "I'm afraid I don't understand. Mr. Whitfield is an associate of my husband's. He's recently entered into a business arrangement with young Ethan Mercer. You know the Mercer Ranch, about 8 miles north?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Well," Emma's hands fluttered like nervous birds. "There's been a complication. Mr. Mercer has been unable to fulfill certain requirements of their agreement, and Mr. Whitfield has suggested a solution that would benefit everyone involved." Mrs. Dorset, please speak plainly. I have papers to grade. Emma's smile went brittle. Mr. Whitfield believes Mr. Mercer needs to project a more stable image. A young bachelor running a ranch raises questions about his reliability. He suggested that Mr. Mercer marry to demonstrate his commitment to building something permanent. Margaret waited. The problem is that Mr. Mercer has no immediate prospects. He's too busy trying to save his property. So Mr. Whitfield proposed that he marry someone practical, someone past the age of romantic nonsense, someone who wouldn't expect— Emma caught herself. Someone sensible. The room had gone very quiet. He suggested you. Margaret heard herself laugh. It sounded wrong, too sharp, like breaking glass. Let me understand this correctly. Mr. Whitfield wants Mr. Mercer to marry me so his business investment appears more respectable? It's not as cold as you're making it sound. How would you make it sound, Mrs. Dorset? Emma's neck flushed red. You're not getting any younger, Margaret, and frankly, opportunities like this don't come along often for women in your position. My position. Unmarried, without family, limited prospects. Emma leaned forward with grotesque sympathy. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help. Ethan Mercer is a good man. The ranch is profitable when he's not dealing with that awful horse. You'd have security, a home. Perhaps this isn't the romance novels make it out to be, but it's more than most women in your situation could hope for. Margaret stood. Her legs felt distant and strange. Please leave. Margaret, get out of my home. Emma rose with injured dignity. I'm trying to do you a kindness, but if you're too proud to accept reality, that's your choice. She left in a rustle of furs and righteous indignation. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it until her breathing steadied. A business arrangement, a practical solution. A woman too old and too plain to expect anything better than being traded like livestock to make some rich man's investment look legitimate. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to set every book on her shelves on fire and watch them burn. Instead, she sat at her desk and graded arithmetic papers until her hands stopped shaking. But 3 days later, Margaret saw Ethan Mercer for the first time. She'd finished teaching for the day and was walking toward Patterson's general store when a commotion erupted near the livery stable. Men shouted, a horse screamed, not the normal whinny, but something raw and terrified. Margaret stopped walking. A crowd had gathered in a loose circle around the corral. She recognized the stance. Men watching violence the way they watched everything, with detached interest and occasional commentary. That devil's gonna kill someone, old Mr. Tucker announced to no one in particular. Should shoot it and be done with it, his son agreed. Margaret moved closer. Inside the corral, a black stallion wheeled and reared, eyes rolling white with panic. Its coat was slick with sweat despite the cold. Every muscle trembled. And standing just outside the fence, watching with the expression of a man staring at his own execution, was Ethan Mercer. Margaret recognized him from town visits, mid-20s, tall, with the kind of lean build that came from actual work rather than vanity. His hat was in his hands. His face was gray. "You gonna try again, Mercer?" Wade Colton called out. He owned the largest spread in the county and wore his wealth like armor. "Or you finally gonna admit you bought a killer?" Ethan didn't answer. "I heard Whitfield's pulling out," Colton continued loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Heard he don't invest in men who can't control their own livestock." "Heard he don't invest in men who can't control their own wives either," someone else added. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt ice form in her stomach. So they knew. Of course they knew. In Red Hollow, secrets lasted about as long as snow in August. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he still didn't speak. "Maybe Miss Whitmore can help you out," Colton said, grinning. "I hear she's real good with stubborn creatures." More laughter. Margaret felt every eye turn toward her. She should leave, walk away, let these men have their entertainment. But the horse screamed again, and something in the sound made her feet move forward instead of back. She pushed through the crowd to the fence. The stallion was bleeding from where it had scraped against the rails. Its breathing came in ragged gasps. And its eyes, those eyes weren't mean or vicious, they were terrified. "Miss Whitmore, you should step back," Ethan said quietly. "He's dangerous." "No, he's not. He's thrown 4 riders and put 2 in the doctor's office. Because you're trying to break him." Margaret kept her voice low. "Look at him. He's not angry. He's scared to death." Ethan stared at her. "He's a horse. He's a living thing that something hurt badly enough to make him think every human wants to kill him." Wade Colton laughed. "Oh, this is perfect. The old maid's going to teach Mercer about his horse now. Margaret ignored him. She climbed up on the bottom rail of the fence. Miss Whitmore, don't. Ethan reached for her arm, but she was already moving. She didn't climb into the corral, didn't try to approach. She just stood there on the rail, her arms resting on the top board, and started talking. Not loud, not commanding, just talking. I know, she said to the horse. I know they hurt you. I know you don't trust them. I wouldn't either. The stallion's ears flicked toward her voice. They don't understand that fear looks like anger when you're trying to survive. They think if you're scared, you must be stupid or mean. But you're not, are you? The horse took one hesitant step toward her. The crowd had gone silent. You're just trying to stay alive in a world that keeps trying to break you into something you're not. Another step. Margaret held out her hand, not grabbing, not demanding, just offering. The black stallion walked slowly across the corral and pressed its nose against her palm. She heard someone behind her exhale sharply. Maybe Ethan, maybe someone else. It didn't matter. The horse that had terrorized 4 grown men stood quietly beneath her touch, while she stroked its neck and murmured words no one else could hear. When she finally climbed down from the fence, the crowd had dispersed to about half its original size. The ones who remained looked at her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Ethan Mercer stared at her like she'd performed a miracle, instead of just being patient. How did you do that? His voice was rough. I didn't do anything. I just stopped trying to win. I don't understand. Margaret brushed hay from her skirt. Her hands were trembling now that the moment had passed. Everyone who's tried to ride him has treated him like an enemy to conquer. He doesn't need conquering. He needs to know he's not going to be hurt. And you could tell that from watching him? I could tell that from being him. The words came out before she could stop them. She felt her face flush. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He removed his hat. Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology. For what? For the whole damn thing. The proposal, the arrangement, all of it. He met her eyes directly. Whitfield and Dorset sold it to me like it was just business. Like it made sense, but it doesn't make sense. It's insulting and wrong, and I should have told them no from the start. Margaret didn't know what to say. I'm not asking you to marry me, Ethan continued. I wouldn't ask any woman to accept what they were offering. But if you'd be willing to help me understand this horse, I'd pay you. Actual money. A fair wage for your time and knowledge. You want to hire me? Yes. To train your horse. To teach me how to train him. There's a difference. Margaret looked back at the corral. The stallion stood watching her, still calm, still waiting. She should say no. She should walk away from this mess and let Ethan Mercer solve his own problems. But something in her chest had unlocked when the horse touched her hand. Something that felt like being seen. Early mornings, she said, before school. I'll come for an hour each day. I'll pay you. We'll discuss payment if this actually works. Right now I'm doing this for the horse, not for you. Ethan nodded slowly. Fair enough. Margaret turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Miss Whitmore? She looked back. Why are you helping me? Margaret considered lying, considered saying something noble about animals or teaching or Christian charity. Instead, she told him the truth. Because I know what it's like when everyone looks at you and only sees the problem you represent instead of the person you are. She left him standing in the cold with that answer. Barik. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the Mercer Ranch just after dawn. Frost covered everything like spilled sugar. Her breath plumed white in the air. Ethan was already waiting by the corral with coffee and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept. Wasn't sure you'd actually come, he admitted. I said I would. People say a lot of things. Margaret took the coffee he offered. It was strong enough to strip paint, and she was grateful for it. Are we going to discuss philosophy or work with the horse? A small smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. Work. They started slowly. Margaret didn't enter the corral that first morning. She just stood at the fence and talked to the stallion while Ethan watched in silence. The horse approached gradually, still wary but less terrified. What are you saying to him? Ethan asked after 20 minutes. Nothing important. I'm just letting him get used to my voice. Does it matter what words you use? Not to him. He's listening to the tone, not the content. Margaret kept her eyes on the horse. Fear is loud. Calm is quiet. He's learning that I'm quiet. And that makes him trust you? Eventually. Ethan shifted his weight. The men I hired tried being gentle at first. It didn't work. Were they actually gentle, or were they just trying to appear gentle while planning to dominate him the moment he let his guard down? No answer. Animals know the difference, Margaret said. They can sense intention. The stallion took another step closer. She reached out slowly and touched his neck. He didn't flinch. What happened to him? She asked quietly. I don't know for certain. I bought him off a trader coming through from Colorado. The man seemed nervous to be rid of him. Ethan paused. There were scars. Old ones. Someone beat him badly at some point. Margaret's hand stilled. So every time someone tries to force him to do something, he remembers being hurt. I suppose so. And you wonder why he fights. She said it without accusation, but Ethan flinched anyway. They worked for another half hour before Margaret's teaching duties called her back to town. The stallion had allowed her to touch his face, his neck, his shoulders. Progress. Same time tomorrow? Ethan asked as she prepared to leave. Yes. Thank you, Miss Whitmore. Margaret. If we're going to spend mornings together, you should use my name. Ethan, he offered. She nodded and left. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Margaret arrived at dawn. They worked with the horse. She left for school. The arrangement was simple and practical and surprisingly peaceful. The stallion improved daily. Margaret started entering the corral with him. She moved slowly, never demanding, always offering. The horse began following her around like a curious child. Ethan watched everything with the intensity of a man trying to decode a foreign language. How do you know when to push and when to wait? He asked one morning. I don't always know. Sometimes I guess wrong. But you're not afraid of him. Margaret considered that. I'm afraid of what might happen if I move too fast or ask too much. But I'm not afraid of him. He's just trying to survive. Most people would say a horse doesn't think that way. Most people don't spend much time actually paying attention to horses. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, you do this with your students too, don't you? The question surprised her. Do what? Watch them. Wait for them to be ready. Refuse to force things. Margaret felt something uncomfortable shift in her chest. I suppose I do. That why you never married? Nobody patient enough to wait for you? The words were out before he seemed to realize how they sounded. His face went red. I apologize. That was inappropriate. No. Margaret kept her voice steady. It's a fair question. The answer is that I never married because no one wanted a woman who wouldn't pretend to be less intelligent than she was. Men want wives who make them feel clever, not women who might correct them at the dinner table. Ethan studied her. Their loss. Is it? Yes. Something in his voice made her look at him directly. His expression was serious, open. Margaret turned back to the horse before the moment could become something she didn't know how to handle. But by the third week, the black stallion, which Ethan had named Smoke, would let Margaret climb on his back. Not riding, just sitting. Her weight distributed carefully while she talked to him and stroked his neck. You should try, Margaret said to Ethan one morning. Try what? Sitting with him like this. He needs to learn that not all riders are enemies. Ethan looked doubtful. He barely tolerates me on the ground, because you still approach him like you're preparing for battle. You need to relax. Easy for you to say. I'm serious, Ethan. Your whole body is tense right now. He can feel it from here. Ethan exhaled slowly and rolled his shoulders. Better? Some. She slid off Smoke's back and gestured for Ethan to try. He approached carefully, hand extended the way she'd taught him. Smoke's ears flicked nervously, but he didn't bolt. Talk to him, Margaret instructed. About what? Anything. He doesn't understand the words. Ethan rested his hand on Smoke's shoulder. Well, horse, I'm about to try something that'll probably get me killed. Despite herself, Margaret smiled. Miss Whitmore finds this amusing, Ethan continued to Smoke. She thinks I'm being dramatic. Maybe I am, but you've got a hell of a kick, and I'd like to keep my ribs intact. He lifted himself slowly onto Smoke's back. The stallion shifted but didn't rear, didn't throw him, just stood there, muscles twitching, deciding what to do. Margaret held her breath. Good boy, Ethan said quietly. That's good. They stayed like that for maybe 30 seconds before Ethan slid back down. That's enough for today, Margaret said. End on a good moment. Ethan looked stunned. He let me. He did. I thought... He stopped, started again. Everyone said he was unrideable, vicious. They said I should sell him for dog meat. Everyone was wrong. Ethan turned to face her fully. You saved him. You know that, right? Without you, I would have given up. You would have figured it out. No, I wouldn't have. His voice was firm. I would have sold him, or shot him, or let Whitfield's ultimatum break me. But you saw something I couldn't see. Margaret felt heat rise in her face. She wasn't used to being looked at this way, like she mattered, like she was necessary. We should get back to work, she said, more sharply than intended. If Ethan noticed her discomfort, he didn't show it. Red Hollow noticed Margaret's morning absences the way a small town noticed everything, quickly and with maximum judgment. The whispers started in the general store and spread through Sunday services like sickness. Margaret Whitmore, riding out to the Mercer place before dawn. Awful convenient, isn't it? Desperate woman chasing a desperate man. Emma Dorset made sure to intercept Margaret after church one Sunday with a smile sharp enough to cut. Margaret, I hear you've been helping Ethan Mercer with his horse. I have. How charitable of you. The words dripped with implication. Though I hope you're not getting your hopes up about the situation. What situation would that be, Mrs. Dorset? Well, just because you're spending time together doesn't mean he's going to marry you. Men like Ethan have options, and you're... She caught herself. You're a lovely person, of course, but what? Margaret's voice was very quiet. Emma's smile wavered. I'm just trying to protect you from disappointment. How thoughtful. I'll be sure to lower my expectations accordingly. She walked away before Emma could continue, but the damage was done. The whole town was watching now, waiting to see if the old maid schoolteacher would humiliate herself chasing a man young enough to be her, well, not her son, but certainly her younger brother. The mockery bothered her less than she expected. What bothered her was the possibility that they might be right. 1 month into their arrangement, disaster arrived in the form of Wade Colton. Margaret was working with Smoke in the corral when she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see Colton and 2 of his ranch hands riding toward them with the casual arrogance of men who'd never been refused anything. Ethan emerged from the barn, his expression darkening. Colton, what do you want? What but do... Wade dismounted with theatrical slowness. Just being neighborly, Mercer. Heard you were still wasting time with that killer horse. Smoke's fine. Smoke, Colton laughed. You gave it a name. That's adorable. His eyes slid to Margaret. And you got the schoolmarm playing ranch hand now? That's even more adorable. Margaret kept her hand on Smoke's neck. The horse's muscles had tensed beneath her touch. Margaret knows more about horses than you ever will, Ethan said flatly. Margaret, is it? Colton's grin widened. You 2 getting real cozy out here every morning? That's enough, Ethan said. I'm just making observations. Lonely woman, desperate man, horse that's about to get you killed anyway. Colton circled closer to the corral. Why don't you save yourself the trouble and sell the beast to me? I'll give you half what you paid and put it out of its misery quick. He's not for sale. Everything's for sale, Mercer. Colton's voice hardened. Especially when you're about to lose your ranch anyway. Margaret saw Ethan's hands curl into fists. Get off my property! Colton held up his hands in mock surrender. Easy. I'm leaving. But when Whitfield pulls his money and you're standing in front of the bank begging for extensions, don't say I didn't offer you a way out. He swung back into his saddle with insulting leisure. And Miss Whitmore? He tipped his hat. You might want to reconsider where you're spending your mornings. Folks are talking. Wouldn't want to damage what's left of your reputation. He rode off with his men trailing behind like loyal dogs. Margaret realized her hands were shaking. Ethan stood rigid, staring at the dust Colton's horses had kicked up. I'm sorry, he said finally. He had no right to speak to you that way. He spoke to you worse. I can handle Colton. Can you? Margaret climbed out of the corral. Because it sounds like he's right, about Whitfield pulling his investment. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Ethan, Whitfield's given me until the end of March. 6 weeks. He finally looked at her. If I can't demonstrate that I'm a stable investment by then, he's walking away. And if he walks, the bank will call in my loans. And you'll lose everything. Yes. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. That's why he proposed the marriage arrangement, to make you look stable. That's why. And you said no. Of course I said no. Ethan's voice turned sharp. What kind of man do you think I am, Margaret? You think I'd actually marry someone just to save my ranch? Men have married for worse reasons. Not me. They stood in silence, Smoke shifted restlessly behind them, sensing the tension. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked finally. "I don't know. You could marry someone else, someone who actually wants the arrangement. There are women in town who would—" "I don't want to marry someone else." The words hung between them. Margaret's breath caught. "Ethan, I should finish fixing that fence," he said abruptly, turning away. "Thank you for your help this morning." He walked toward the barn before she could respond. Margaret stood alone in the yard, her heart beating too fast, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to understand what she wanted to happen. Tsak. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed listening to wind rattle her window and thought about Ethan Mercer losing everything because he refused to treat her like a business transaction. She thought about Wade Colton's smug face. She thought about Emma Dorset's pitying smiles and the town's whispers and the way people had looked at her for 38 years like she was something incomplete. And she thought about the way Ethan had looked at her in the corral, like she was the solution, like she was necessary, like she was wanted. Was it real? Or was she just another Margaret, another desperate woman convincing herself that proximity meant affection? She didn't know. But somewhere around midnight, Margaret admitted something she'd been avoiding. She didn't want Ethan to lose his ranch, not because of Whitfield's money or Colton's threats, but because she'd started to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere, to have a place that was hers, to matter beyond a classroom and a rented room. The thought terrified her. She'd spent decades building walls around those kinds of hopes, and now Ethan Mercer was threatening to tear them all down with nothing but patience and a broken horse. The decision came to Margaret 3 days later while she was teaching fractions to a room full of restless children. Sarah Chen raised her hand. "Miss Whitmore, you're writing the wrong numbers." Margaret looked at the chalkboard and realized she'd been writing the same equation over and over without solving it. Her mind had been 8 miles north at a ranch she had no claim to. "You're right, Sarah, thank you." She erased the board and started again, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same impossible question. What did she actually want? The answer scared her more than the alternative. When school ended, Margaret walked to the Dorset house before she could change her mind. Emma answered the door with obvious surprise. "Margaret, this is unexpected. I need to speak with your husband." Emma's eyebrows rose. "About what?" "About Charles Whitfield's arrangement." The sitting room where Mayor Dorset received her smelled like cigar smoke and leather. He sat behind a desk that seemed designed to make visitors feel small, his expression somewhere between curious and condescending. "Miss Whitmore, my wife said you wanted to discuss the Mercer situation. I want to know the exact terms of Mr. Whitfield's ultimatum." Dorset leaned back in his chair. "That's a private business matter, not if it involves me being traded like livestock to legitimize your investment." His face hardened. "Nobody's trading anyone. Mr. Whitfield simply suggested that a married man presents a more stable investment than a bachelor. And he specifically suggested Ethan marry me. He suggested someone practical, someone who wouldn't have unrealistic expectations about the arrangement." "Someone desperate, you mean?" Dorset had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I wouldn't put it that way." "How would you put it, Mayor?" He sighed. "Look, Miss Whitmore, I understand this seems harsh, but this is business. Whitfield is investing significant capital in this territory. He wants assurances that the people he backs won't squander his money on foolishness. A wife, particularly a sensible woman of a certain age, suggests stability and good judgment. I'm 38, not 60. You're past the age where romance clouds practical thinking. That's actually an asset in this situation." Margaret felt her jaw tighten. "What happens to Ethan if he doesn't marry?" "Whitfield withdraws his investment. The bank calls in Mercer's loans. He loses the ranch within 6 months, probably sooner." Dorset studied her. "But I was told you already declined the arrangement." "I did." "Then why are you here?" Margaret stood. "I wanted to understand exactly what kind of men I'm dealing with. Now I do." She left before he could respond. Outside, the March wind cut through her coat like knives. She stood on the Dorset's porch, trying to steady her breathing and her racing thoughts. Charles Whitfield saw her as a solution to a problem. Mayor Dorset saw her as a convenient piece to move on a board. Even Emma, with her false kindness, saw her as someone whose value was measured entirely by her usefulness to men. The only person who'd never looked at her that way was Ethan, and he was going to lose everything because he'd refused to use her. Margaret walked home through streets that felt different now, smaller, meaner. She'd spent 2 decades trying to find dignity in this town, and all she'd found was a teaching position that barely paid rent and a reputation as the woman nobody wanted. Maybe it was time to stop looking for dignity and start demanding it. The next morning, she arrived at the ranch before dawn as usual. Ethan was already in the corral with Smoke, moving slowly through the exercises she'd taught him. He saw her and stopped. "I didn't think you'd come today." "Why wouldn't I? I heard you went to see Dorset yesterday. Figured you might be done with all this." Small-town gossip traveled faster than cholera. "I needed information," Margaret said simply. She climbed up on the fence rail. "How's he doing?" "Good. Better every day." Ethan ran his hand along Smoke's neck. "I got on him yesterday. Actually rode him around the corral twice before he got nervous." "That's real progress." "Yeah." Ethan's voice was flat despite the accomplishment. "Won't matter much in a few weeks when I'm selling everything at auction." Margaret watched him for a long moment. His shoulders were tight with tension that had nothing to do with the horse. "What if you didn't have to sell?" He looked up sharply. "What? What if there was a way to keep the ranch and Whitfield's investment?" "Margaret, don't. Let me finish." She gripped the fence rail hard enough to feel splinters bite into her palms. "I went to Dorset because I wanted to understand the full situation, the actual terms, and now I do. And? And I'm going to make you an offer." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'll marry you." Ethan went very still. Even Smoke seemed to sense the shift in the air. "No." "Listen to me." "Absolutely not." His voice was hard. "I told you before, I'm not doing that to you." "You're not doing anything to me. I'm making a choice. A choice based on pity or guilt or whatever the hell you're feeling right now, but it's not a real choice." Ethan stepped closer to the fence. "Margaret, you deserve better than being someone's solution to a business problem." "Better than what? Another 20 years alone in Red Hollow? Another 2 decades of being the woman people whisper about after church?" She heard her voice rising and couldn't stop it. "At least this way I'd have something that's mine. A place. A purpose." "You already have purpose. You teach half the children in this county." "I teach other people's children and then go home to a room the size of a closet where I sit alone every night reading books about other people's lives." The words came out harder than she intended. "I'm tired, Ethan. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of being pitied. I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt when the whole town treats me like some tragic figure who missed her chance." Ethan's expression had shifted to something she couldn't read. "This wouldn't be like that," she continued, quieter now. "We'd go into it honestly. Partners. Not romance, not pretending, just two people helping each other survive. You get to keep your ranch. I get to stop being Red Hollow's favorite object of pity. It makes sense." "It makes sense." Ethan repeated the words like he was testing them. "That's what you want? An arrangement that makes sense?" "Yes." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he climbed over the fence and stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "About what?" "About people not seeing you. I see you, Margaret. Every morning when you walk up to that corral, I see you. The way you move around Smoke like you're speaking a language nobody else understands. The way you teach me to be patient when every instinct I have says to force things. The way you look at the world like you're cataloging all the ways it's broken and deciding which pieces you can fix." His voice was rough. "So don't tell me you're invisible. Not to me." Margaret's breath caught. "But I won't marry you for Whitfield's money," Ethan continued. "I won't look at you across a table 10 years from now and know that you settled for convenience because you thought it was your only option. You deserve to be chosen, Margaret. Actually chosen, not accepted as a practical solution." The words hurt worse than rejection. Margaret climbed down from the fence. Her legs felt unsteady. "Then I guess we're done here." Margaret. "No, you're right. It was a stupid idea." She started walking toward where she'd tied her horse. "I'll send someone else to work with Smoke. Maybe Doc Harrison's son. He's good with animals." Ethan caught her arm. "Don't go." "Why not? There's no point in continuing this if... Because I'm trying to do the right thing, and you're making it damn difficult." She yanked her arm free. "The right thing? You're going to lose your ranch because you're too proud to accept help. How is that right?" "I'm not too proud, I'm too..." He stopped, ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm trying to protect you." "I don't need protection. I need someone to take me seriously when I say what I want." "And what do you want, Margaret? Really?" She opened her mouth to answer and found she couldn't, because the truth was complicated and terrifying, and she wasn't sure she could say it out loud without breaking something fundamental inside herself. "I want to matter," she said finally. "I want to wake up in a place where I belong instead of a rented room where the landlord can evict me on 30 days' notice. I want to build something instead of watching everyone else build their lives while I stand on the sidelines grading papers. I want—" Her voice cracked. "I want to stop feeling like I'm waiting for a life that's never going to start." Ethan looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. "Marry me," she said again. "Not because Whitfield demands it, not because the town expects it, but because it's practical and honest and better than the alternatives we're both facing." He didn't answer right away. Behind them, smoke whinnied softly. "Give me time to think," Ethan said finally. Margaret nodded and left before he could see the tears she refused to shed. She made it halfway home before she had to stop and sit on a fallen log because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the reins. She'd just proposed marriage to a man she'd known for 6 weeks, offered herself up like some kind of business transaction, exactly what she'd sworn she'd never do. But the alternative, going back to her small room, her small life, watching Ethan lose everything while she remained safely, miserably unchanged, felt worse than any humiliation. Margaret sat in the cold Wyoming morning and admitted what she'd been avoiding since that first day at the corral. She didn't just want to help Ethan save his ranch, she wanted to be part of it. And that wanting terrified her more than a lifetime of loneliness ever had. 2 days passed with no word from Ethan. Margaret continued teaching, continued maintaining the careful facade of normalcy while her insides twisted themselves into knots. Sarah Chen noticed. "Are you sick, Miss Whitmore? You look pale." "I'm fine, sweetheart." But she wasn't fine. She was unraveling. On the third day, Wade Colton made sure everyone in Red Hollow heard about Margaret's proposal. She was leaving Patterson's general store when she heard him holding court outside the saloon. "I heard she actually asked him," Colton announced loud enough to carry across the street. "The old maid finally got desperate enough to propose to a man young enough to be her—" "Careful, Wade." The voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through Colton's speech. Margaret turned to see Ethan standing in the street, hat in hand, looking at Colton with an expression that could freeze water. "You got something to say, Mercer?" "Yeah, keep Miss Whitmore's name out of your mouth." Colton laughed. "Or what? You'll defend her honor. That's rich considering everyone knows she's throwing herself at you." He didn't finish the sentence. Ethan crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and hit Colton hard enough to knock him off the saloon steps into the dirt. The street went silent. Colton pushed himself up, blood trickling from his split lip. "You're going to regret that." "Probably, but it was worth it." 2 of Colton's ranched hands moved forward, but he waved them off. He stood slowly, wiping blood from his mouth. "You're finished in this county, Mercer. I'll make sure of it." "Get in line!" Colton spat blood into the dirt and walked away, his men trailing behind him like kicked dogs. Ethan stood in the middle of the street, flexing his right hand until Margaret walked up to him. "That was stupid," she said. "Yeah. He'll make trouble for you now." He was already making trouble. Margaret looked at his split knuckles. "You're bleeding." "He's bleeding more." Despite everything, she felt something like a smile trying to form. "Come on, let me clean that up before it gets infected." She led him back to her room above the milliner's shop, acutely aware of the stares following them. Let them look, let them talk. She was too tired to care anymore. Inside, she poured water from the pitcher and found clean cloth while Ethan sat at her small desk, looking around her room with open curiosity. "This is where you live?" "Yes. It's smaller than my tack room." "I'm aware." She took his hand and started cleaning the blood away. His knuckles were raw but not seriously damaged. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of listening to people talk about you like you're something pitiful instead of the strongest person I know." Margaret's hands stilled. "I'm not strong." "You're the strongest person I know," Ethan repeated. "You've survived 2 decades in a town that treats you like furniture. You get up every morning and teach children who are going to grow up and forget you. You helped me save a horse everyone said was worthless. And then you offered to marry me, even though you knew it would make you the subject of every cruel joke in Red Hollow." He met her eyes. "That's not weakness, Margaret. That's courage I'll never have." She couldn't breathe properly. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Ethan continued, "and you're right. It makes sense, practical sense." He paused. "But I need you to understand something before we do this." "What?" If we get married, I won't treat you like a business arrangement. I won't treat you like you're doing me a favor I need to repay. You'll be my partner in everything, the ranch, the decisions, all of it. Your voice carries the same weight as mine. Your opinions matter. You're not some accessory to make Whitfield happy. He stopped. You're Margaret, and that's more than enough. The tears Margaret had been holding back for 3 days finally broke through. Ethan looked alarmed. Did I say something wrong? She shook her head, unable to speak. Margaret, nobody's ever said anything like that to me before. Her voice came out rough. Not once. Not ever. He took her hand carefully, mindful of his split knuckles against her palm. Then everyone you've known is an idiot. She laughed despite the tears. That's probably true. They sat in silence while Margaret pulled herself back together. Outside, she could hear normal life continuing. Wagons, voices, the distant sound of a dog barking. So, Ethan said finally, are we doing this? Margaret looked at him, really looked. He wasn't handsome in any conventional way. His face was too weathered, his hands too rough, his manner too direct. But he was looking at her like she was something worth seeing. Yes, she said, we're doing this. No regrets later when you realize you married a man about to lose everything to the bank? No regrets when you realize you married a woman the whole town considers a desperate old maid? Deal. They shook hands like they were closing a business transaction, which Margaret supposed they were. Except it didn't feel like business anymore. It felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping someone had put water at the bottom instead of rocks. The wedding happened 6 days later in Mayor Dorset's office, with no celebration, no guests, and no illusions about what they were doing. Margaret wore the same dress she wore to church. Ethan wore clothes that smelled like horse and hay because he'd come straight from the ranch. Emma Dorset served as witness while looking like she'd bitten into something sour. Do you, Ethan James Mercer, take this woman? Yes, Ethan interrupted. Dorset frowned. I haven't finished. I take her. Can we skip to the end? Margaret felt that inappropriate smile trying to form again. Miss Whitmore, Dorset said with strained patience, do you take this man? Yes. For heaven's sake, let me finish the ceremony. We take each other, Margaret said, legally and completely. Is that sufficient? Dorset looked at his wife. Emma shrugged. Fine. You're married. Sign here. They signed the papers. Margaret's hand was steady. Ethan's wasn't. Outside the office, they stood on the steps while Red Hollow went about its business around them. Well, Ethan said, that was romantic. It was efficient. Should I carry you over a threshold or something? Please don't. He smiled, actually smiled. Come on, Mrs. Mercer, let's go home. Mrs. Mercer. The name felt foreign and strange and oddly right. Margaret collected her few belongings from the room above the milliner's shop, while Mrs. Patterson watched with barely concealed disapproval. You're making a mistake, the older woman said. Marrying that boy at your age. People are going to talk. People are already talking. At least now they'll have something real to discuss. Everything Margaret owned fit into 2 trunks and a carpet bag. 2 decades of life reduced to luggage that barely filled a wagon bed. Ethan loaded them without comment and helped her up onto the seat. The ride to the ranch was quiet. Margaret watched the landscape roll past, brown grass, scattered pine, endless sky, and tried to process that this was her home now. Not rented, not temporary, hers. The ranch house was smaller than she'd imagined. 1 story, weathered wood, a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. But it was solid, real. Ethan helped her down from the wagon. It's not much. It's more than I had yesterday. Inside was simple. Main room with a fireplace, kitchen area, 2 bedrooms. The furniture was sparse and practical, no decoration, no softness. I'll take the back room, Ethan said, setting her trunks down. You should have the larger one. We don't have to pretend for anyone here, Ethan. We can be honest about what this is. He looked at her for a long moment. What is this, Margaret? A partnership, an arrangement, 2 people helping each other. Right. Something flickered across his face. I'll get the rest of your things. He left her standing in what was now her home, feeling like she'd said the wrong thing without understanding why. That night, Margaret lay in a bed that wasn't hers, in a room that didn't feel familiar, and listened to the sounds of a house settling around her. Wind. Wood creaking. The distant sound of horses in the barn. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. married a man she barely knew to save his ranch and escape her own stagnant life. It was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most foolish. She wouldn't know which until morning. Morning came with Ethan knocking on her door before dawn. "Margaret, you awake?" She sat up, disoriented. "Yes." "Smoke's acting strange. I think something's wrong." She dressed quickly and followed him to the barn. The black stallion was pacing his stall, agitated and sweating despite the cold. His breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow. "When did this start?" Margaret asked. "About an hour ago. I came out to check the water and found him like this." She moved slowly into the stall, speaking in the low, calm voice Smoke knew. The horse turned toward her but didn't settle. "Easy, boy, easy." She ran her hands along his side and felt his muscles quivering beneath the skin. When she pressed gently on his abdomen, he flinched. "Colic," she said. "Maybe just gas, maybe something worse. We need to keep him moving." They spent the next 3 hours walking Smoke around the corral while Margaret monitored his condition. Ethan stayed close, ready to help, but letting her lead. As dawn broke across the valley, Smoke finally settled. His breathing evened out. The pain passed. Margaret leaned against the fence, exhausted. "You saved him again," Ethan said. "I just knew what to look for." "How'd you learn that?" "Books, mostly. I read everything I could find about horses after I started teaching. Figured if I couldn't have my own, I could at least understand them." Ethan stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being here, for knowing what to do, for—" He stopped. "For everything." Margaret looked at him. His face was drawn with exhaustion, but there was something else in his expression now, something that made her chest feel tight. "This is my home now," she said. "These are my responsibilities, too." "That what this feels like to you? Responsibility?" "What else would it be?" He didn't answer, just looked at her with that expression she couldn't name until Smoke whinnied from behind them, breaking the moment. "I should make breakfast," Margaret said, stepping away. "You must be starving." She walked back to the house before he could respond, her heart beating too fast for someone who'd just finished a simple conversation about responsibilities and partnership and nothing else. Nothing else at all. The first week of marriage passed in a careful dance of politeness and distance. Margaret taught during the day and returned to the ranch each afternoon to find Ethan already working, mending fences, feeding livestock, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch from falling apart. They ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, making conversation about weather and horses and nothing that mattered. Then they retreated to separate rooms like strangers sharing a boarding house. It was exactly what Margaret had proposed. Partnership. Practicality. No expectations beyond mutual survival. So why did it feel like she was holding her breath waiting for something to break? On the 8th day, Charles Whitfield arrived. Margaret was in the garden attempting to resurrect what had once been a vegetable patch when she heard the expensive carriage roll up the drive. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and watched a man in a suit that probably cost more than the ranch descend like royalty visiting peasants. Ethan emerged from the barn, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Whitfield, wasn't expecting you until next week. I was in the area. Thought I'd see how my investment was progressing." Whitfield's eyes slid to Margaret with open assessment. "And you must be the new Mrs. Mercer." "Margaret Whitmore." She didn't correct the name. Technically, it was Mercer now, but the word still felt borrowed. "Charming." Whitfield's tone suggested he found nothing charming about her at all. "I trust the marriage has provided the stability we discussed." "We're managing," Ethan said flatly. Managing. Whitfield walked toward the corral where Smoke stood watching them with wary interest. "And the horse? Still trying to kill anyone who approaches?" "He's been ridden successfully for 2 weeks now." Whitfield's eyebrows rose. "By you?" "By both of us." "How progressive." The sarcasm was thick enough to choke on. "Well, Mr. Mercer, I'll be honest. I've heard concerning reports about your financial situation, rumors that you're still struggling despite our arrangement." Margaret saw Ethan's jaw tighten. "The ranch is sound," he said. "We've got good stock, good land, and substantial debt. Debt that my investment was supposed to address." Whitfield turned to face them both. "I'm beginning to wonder if I made a mistake backing you." "You didn't." "Prove it." Whitfield gestured toward Smoke. "Show me this supposedly tamed killer horse. Let's see if my money bought anything besides a convenient wife." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, But Ethan spoke before she could. Margaret is not part of your investment, Whitfield. She's my wife, and she deserves your respect. Respect? Whitfield laughed. I'm investing $15,000 in this operation. I'll respect whatever I damn well please. Then respect the door on your way out. The silence that followed was absolute. Whitfield's face turned an ugly shade of red. Excuse me? You heard me? Get off my property. You can't be serious. Without your backing, I'll figure something else out. But I won't stand here and let you talk about my wife like she's livestock. Margaret's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Whitfield looked between them with something like disbelief. You're throwing away your entire future over wounded pride? I'm throwing away a business partner who doesn't know how to behave like a decent human being. Fine. Whitfield straightened his jacket with sharp, angry movements. Consider our agreement terminated. You have 30 days to pay back what you've already borrowed. After that, I'll make sure every bank in the territory knows you're a bad investment. He climbed back into his carriage. Enjoy your principles, Mercer. They'll keep you warm when you're sleeping in a ditch. The carriage rolled away in a cloud of dust. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the empty road. Margaret walked up beside him. You just destroyed your only chance to save this place. I know. 30 days isn't enough time to find another investor. I know that too. Then why? Because I meant what I said when we got married. He finally looked at her. You're not a bargaining chip. You're not some convenient solution to make men like Whitfield comfortable. You're my wife, and I won't let anyone treat you like you're worth less than that. Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest. Even if it costs you everything? Even then. They stood in the yard while the sun climbed higher and the impossible reality of what he'd just done settled over them like snow. Ethan had chosen her over his ranch, over his livelihood, over his entire future. And Margaret didn't know if that was the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed or the most terrifying. That night, they sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, going through the ranch's finances with the grim determination of soldiers counting ammunition before a losing battle. If I sell half the herd, I can cover 2 months of debt payments, Ethan said, running his finger down columns of numbers. Maybe 3 if cattle prices hold. And then what? Then I sell more, until there's nothing left to sell. Margaret looked at the ledger. The numbers were worse than she'd imagined. Even with Whitfield's backing, Ethan had been operating on borrowed time. What about the horse? She asked quietly. Ethan's head snapped up. No. Ethan, I'm not selling Smoke, especially not to someone who'll mistreat him. Even if keeping him means losing the ranch faster. He closed the ledger with more force than necessary. Yes. Margaret studied him in the lamplight. His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, but there was something else there too. Something stubborn and decent that made her chest ache. You're going to lose everything because you refuse to compromise on anything that matters to you, she said. Probably. That's not very practical. I married you, didn't I? That wasn't practical either. The words hit her sideways. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan leaned back in his chair. Nothing. I'm tired. I'm saying things wrong. No, you started this. Finish it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, marrying you was the least practical decision I've made in 5 years. You're difficult and opinionated, and you don't pretend to be something you're not. You make me question every assumption I've ever had about how things should work. And you scare the hell out of me. Margaret couldn't breathe properly. But you're also the only person who's ever looked at me and seen past the ranch, and the debts, and the desperate scrambling. You see me, Margaret, the actual person. And that's worth more than Whitfield's money, or this ranch, or anything else. He met her eyes. So no, marrying you wasn't practical. But it was right. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence. Margaret's hands were shaking. She folded them in her lap so he wouldn't notice. I don't know what to say to that. You don't have to say anything. Ethan stood. I'm going to check the horses. Get some sleep. He left her sitting alone at the table with the ledger and her racing thoughts, and the terrible, wonderful knowledge that this marriage had stopped being an arrangement somewhere between the corral and the kitchen, and she hadn't even noticed when. The next morning brought worse news in the form of a letter from the bank. Ethan read it twice before handing it to Margaret without comment. The bank was calling in his loans. Not in 30 days. In 2 weeks. They wanted full payment, or they'd seize the property and livestock to cover the debt. Can they do this? Margaret asked. They can do whatever they want. I signed papers giving them that right when I was desperate and stupid. There has to be something. There isn't. Ethan's voice was flat. It's over. Margaret looked around the kitchen. The house that had become her home in just 8 days. The ranch that had started to feel like the first place she'd ever truly belonged. What are you going to do? Sell what I can before they take it. At least that way I'll have something to start over with. Start over where? He shrugged. California, maybe. I hear there's work in the lumber camps. And leave Wyoming? Leave everything you've built? Everything I've built is about to be seized by the bank, Margaret. There's nothing to leave. She wanted to argue, to find some solution he hadn't thought of. But the numbers in the ledger didn't lie, and neither did the letter from the bank. Ethan was going to lose his ranch, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. Red Hollow heard about Whitfield's withdrawal within 24 hours, because of course they did. Margaret was walking home from school when Wade Colton intercepted her outside the general store. Mrs. Mercer, his smile was all teeth, heard your husband's having some financial difficulties. Mr. Colton, shame about Whitfield pulling out, but I suppose that's what happens when you let pride override good business sense. He stepped closer. You know, I'd be willing to make an offer on the Mercer place, before the bank takes it. Ethan could walk away with something instead of nothing. That's between you and my husband. Is it? Because I was thinking maybe you could convince him. Woman's touch and all that. Colton's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Unless you're planning to follow him to whatever ditch he ends up in. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. My marriage is none of your concern. Oh, I think it is. See, everyone knows you married Mercer to escape spinsterhood, but now he's got nothing to offer you. No ranch, no money, no future. So I'm wondering how long before you realize you made a mistake and come looking for better options. Better options like you? I own the largest spread in 3 counties. I could give you things Mercer never could. Security, comfort, respect. I'd rather sleep in a barn than take anything from you. Colton's smile vanished. Careful, Mrs. Mercer. Your husband can't afford to make enemies right now. Neither can you. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Think about my offer. Time's running out for both of you. He walked away before she could respond. Margaret stood on the street, shaking with rage and something close to fear. Colton wasn't wrong about their situation. They were running out of time and options. But the thought of selling to him, of watching him take Ethan's ranch and turn it into another piece of his empire, made her physically sick. When she got home, she found Ethan in the barn, inventorying everything they'd have to sell. Colton approached me today, she said without preamble. Ethan's shoulders tensed. What did he want? To make an offer on the ranch, and to suggest I might want to reconsider my marriage choices. That son of a... Ethan turned to face her. Did he threaten you? Not exactly, but he made it clear he thinks I'll abandon you once there's nothing left. And will you? The question caught her off guard. What? Will you leave? Because I wouldn't blame you if you did. You married me thinking you'd have a home and security. Now I can't give you either one. Margaret moved closer. Do you want me to leave? No, but that's not the question. It's the only question that matters. She met his eyes. I married you, Ethan, for better or worse. I'm not leaving because things got difficult. Even if difficult means losing everything? Even then. He stared at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces for. Why? He asked finally. Why would you stay with a man who can't even provide you with a roof over your head? Margaret thought about all the careful, practical reasons she could give. The partnership, the arrangement, the simple fact that she'd made a commitment. But standing in the barn with dust motes floating through afternoon light, and Ethan looking at her like her answer actually mattered, she found she was tired of lying. Because I don't want to leave, she said simply. Because in 8 days, this ranch has felt more like home than 20 years in Red Hollow ever did. Because you treat me like I matter, not like I'm useful or convenient, but like I actually matter. Her voice wavered. And because losing the ranch is terrible, but losing you would be worse. The silence stretched between them. Then Ethan closed the distance and kissed her. Not tentatively, not asking permission, just kissing her like it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had stopped making any sense at all. Margaret froze for half a second before kissing him back. His hands were rough and gentle at the same time. He tasted like coffee and desperation and something she couldn't name. She grabbed his shirt to keep from falling because her legs had forgotten how to support her weight. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. That wasn't part of our arrangement, he said. No. Should I apologize? Do you want to? Not even slightly. Margaret laughed despite everything. Despite the bank foreclosure and Wade Colton's threats and the fact that they were standing in a barn they'd both be evicted from in less than 2 weeks. We're a mess, she said. Complete disaster. We should probably talk about this. Probably. Ethan pulled back just enough to see her face. But right now I need to finish the inventory so I know what we're working with. We. You just said you're staying. That makes it we. Something warm bloomed in Margaret's chest. I suppose it does. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, cataloging livestock and equipment and supplies. The numbers were still terrible. The situation was still impossible, but they were facing it together, and somehow that made it bearable. That night, Ethan knocked on Margaret's bedroom door around midnight. You awake? Yes. She was still fully dressed, sitting by the window with a book she couldn't focus on. Can I come in? She opened the door. He stood in the hallway looking uncertain in a way that was completely unlike him. I can't sleep, he admitted. Keep thinking about the bank and Colton and all of it. Me too. Can I stay? Just to talk. I promise I'll behave. Margaret stepped aside. Ethan came in and sat in the chair by the window while she settled back on the bed. Tell me something about yourself, he said. Something I don't know. Like what? Anything. Your childhood, your family, how you ended up in Red Hollow. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She didn't talk about her past, ever. It was easier to just be the present version of herself without dragging history into it. But sitting in the dark with Ethan watching her with genuine interest, she found she wanted to tell him. My parents died when I was 17, she said. Cholera. They owned a small farm in Ohio, and when they died, their debts were more than the property was worth. I had an aunt in Wyoming who offered to take me in if I could get myself here. That must have been terrifying. It was. I traveled alone on the train with everything I owned in one trunk and $20 my mother had hidden in a book. Margaret pulled her knees up to her chest. The aunt turned out to be less charitable than her letters suggested. She put me to work in her boarding house and made it clear I was a burden she was tolerating out of family obligation. How long did you stay? 3 years. Then I passed the teaching exam and got hired in Red Hollow. I've been here ever since. 20 years in a town that treats you like you're invisible. Ethan shook his head. I don't know how you survived it. You survive by not expecting anything better. Lower your expectations enough and disappointment becomes impossible. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Margaret smiled without humor. It's practical. It's lonely. Yes, it is. She looked at him directly. What about you? How does a man end up drowning in debt trying to save a ranch in the middle of Wyoming? Stupidity, mostly. Ethan leaned back. My father owned this land. Left it to me when he died 5 years ago, along with debts he'd never mentioned. I thought I could work my way out of it. Thought if I just pushed hard enough, made the right deals, took the right risks, I could build something that mattered. It does matter. Not if the bank takes it next week. It still matters that you tried, that you cared enough to fight for it. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. You really believe that? Yes. Even though I'm going to fail? You haven't failed yet. You're still fighting. He stood and moved to sit beside her on the bed. Not touching, just close enough that she could feel his warmth. Margaret, what are we doing here? I don't know. This was supposed to be practical, an arrangement, 2 people helping each other survive. I know. But it doesn't feel like that anymore. Margaret's heart was beating too fast. No, it doesn't. So what do we do about it? She turned to face him. What do you want to do about it? I want to kiss you again. I want to tell you that you're the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years. I want to stop pretending this is just business, when every time I look at you I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something I don't understand. He reached for her hand. But I don't have anything to offer you anymore. No home, no security, no future. Just me and a whole lot of problems. Maybe that's enough. Is it? Margaret thought about everything she'd learned in 38 years of survival. About lowered expectations and practical choices and protecting yourself from disappointment. Then she thought about Ethan standing up to Whitfield, about him defending her to Wade Colton, about the way he looked at her like she was something precious instead of convenient. Yes, she said, it's enough. This time when he kissed her, there was no desperation, just certainty. They kissed until Margaret forgot about the bank and the foreclosure and everything that was falling apart outside this room. They kissed until she forgot to be afraid. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan stayed close enough that she could feel his breath. "If we lose the ranch," he started. "When we lose the ranch," Margaret corrected gently, "we need to be realistic. When we lose the ranch, you could leave. Start over somewhere without all my baggage dragging you down. I could. But I won't." "Why not?" Margaret touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, this stopped being about the ranch, or Red Hollow, or escaping loneliness. It became about you. And I don't want to lose you, Ethan, even if losing everything else is the price." His eyes closed. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears. "I love you," he said. "I know that's not part of our arrangement, and I know the timing is terrible, and I know I have no right to say it when I can't even keep a roof over your head. But I love you, Margaret, and I needed you to know that before everything falls apart." Margaret felt her own tears starting. "You're right, the timing is terrible. I know, and it's not part of our arrangement. I know that too, but I love you anyway." She kissed him softly. "Despite all the reasons I shouldn't." They held each other while the night pressed in around them and the uncertain future waited just beyond the bedroom door. Outside, storm clouds were building on the horizon. But inside, for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't alone. They woke the next morning to rain hammering against the windows like fists demanding entry. Margaret lay still for a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar weight of Ethan's arm across her waist. He'd fallen asleep in her bed sometime after midnight, both of them too exhausted from confession and kissing to care about propriety anymore. Now, with gray dawn light filtering through the curtains and reality pressing back in, she had to resist the urge to panic. She loved him. She'd actually said the words out loud, and he loved her back, which was either a miracle or a disaster depending on how the next 2 weeks played out. Ethan stirred beside her. "Is it supposed to rain this hard in March?" "Probably not." "That's what I thought." He sat up, rubbing his face. "I should check the livestock, make sure everything's secure." He started to leave, but Margaret caught his hand. "Ethan." "Yeah?" "Last night wasn't a mistake." His expression softened. "I know. I just needed to say it, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering." He kissed her forehead. "But I'm glad you said it anyway." He left to deal with the storm, and Margaret dressed quickly, her mind already racing through problems that needed solving. The rain was getting worse. If it kept up, they'd have flooding in the lower pastures. And with the bank foreclosure looming, they couldn't afford to lose any livestock to drowning or injury. She found Ethan in the barn, already soaked through despite his coat. "It's bad," he said without preamble. "The creek's rising fast. If this keeps up, we'll have to move the herd to higher ground." "Can we do that in this weather?" "We'll have to try. Otherwise we lose half the cattle." They spent the next 3 hours in driving rain, pushing reluctant cattle up the hillside while mud sucked at their boots and thunder rolled across the valley like artillery fire. Margaret's skirt was plastered to her legs. Her hair had come completely loose from its pins. She was colder than she'd ever been in her life. But she kept moving because Ethan was beside her and the cattle needed saving, and this was her ranch now too. By noon, they'd managed to get most of the herd to safety. Ethan was checking the fence line when Margaret heard him shout. She ran toward his voice and found him at the corral. Smoke was gone. The gate had broken loose in the wind. The black stallion had bolted into the storm. "How long has he been out?" Margaret yelled over the rain. "I don't know. Could be minutes, could be an hour. We have to find him." "Margaret, it's too dangerous. The visibility's terrible, and if he's spooked..." "He's terrified, Ethan. He's out there alone thinking he's being punished again. We can't just leave him." Ethan looked torn between practicality and the same loyalty that had made him refuse to sell smoke weeks ago. "Fine, but we stay together. If the weather gets worse, we turn back." They saddled 2 of the calmer horses and rode out into rain that felt like punishment. The wind had picked up, bending trees and tearing at their clothes. Margaret couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. "Smoke," she called, knowing it was probably useless. "Come on, boy." Nothing but wind and thunder answered. They searched for an hour, riding through conditions that got steadily worse. The creek had burst its banks in 3 places. Water rushed across what had been dry ground that morning. Margaret was about to suggest they turn back when she heard it. A horse screaming. She wheeled her mount toward the sound, ignoring Ethan's shout to wait. Through the rain, she could barely make out a dark shape thrashing in what looked like mud. Not mud. The old well. Smoke had fallen into the abandoned well on the eastern edge of the property. The one Ethan had been meaning to fill in for months but never found time. The stallion was trapped up to his chest in collapsed earth and water, fighting to keep his head above the rising flood. No, no, no! Margaret dismounted before her horse had fully stopped. Ethan grabbed her arm. Margaret, you can't get him out of there. The ground's not stable. Then we find rope. We pull him out. With what? We don't have the equipment? Then we do it by hand if we have to, but I'm not leaving him to drown. She wrenched free and moved as close to the well as she dared. The ground felt spongy beneath her boots. One wrong step and she'd be in there with Smoke. Hey, she called to the panicked horse. Hey, it's me. I'm here. Smoke's eyes rolled white with terror, but his ears swiveled toward her voice. I know you're scared. I know this is exactly what you were always afraid would happen, but I'm not leaving you. Do you hear me? I'm not leaving. Margaret, the ground's giving way. Ethan was right behind her now, close enough to grab her if she started to fall. Do we have rope in the saddlebags? Yes, but get it, now. He ran back to the horses while Margaret kept talking to Smoke, her voice the only anchor she could offer while rain poured down and mud sucked at the stallion's struggling body. Ethan returned with rope, and they worked fast, tying loops and throwing them toward Smoke's thrashing head. The first 3 attempts missed. The fourth caught around his neck. Pull! Margaret shouted. They pulled together, leaning all their weight against the rope while Smoke fought on the other end. The horse was strong, but he was also exhausted and terrified and sinking deeper with every movement. It's not working, Ethan gasped. He's too deep. Then we need more leverage. Tie it to your horse. Margaret, do it! Ethan secured the rope to his horse's saddle and urged the animal backward. The rope went taut. For a horrible moment, nothing happened. Then Smoke lurched forward, front hooves scrabbling at the well's edge. Keep going! Margaret moved closer, reaching for Smoke's bridle to guide him. The ground beneath her feet shifted. Margaret, get back. Too late. The earth collapsed and she went down. She had 1 second to register falling before hitting ice-cold water. The shock drove the air from her lungs. She went under, weighted down by her soaked skirts, and came up gasping. Smoke was still struggling beside her, his massive body taking up most of the space in the well. One of his hooves caught her shoulder and pain exploded across her back. Margaret! Ethan's voice sounded miles away. She grabbed for the rope still around Smoke's neck, using it to pull herself closer to the wall. Her fingers found purchase in the crumbling earth, but it gave way immediately. Ethan, I can't. Hold on. Just hold on. She was trying, but the water was rising fast and Smoke's thrashing was making waves that kept pushing her under. She went down again, swallowing mud and water, and came up coughing. This was how she was going to die, trapped in a well with a terrified horse, while her husband watched helplessly from above. Not the ending she'd imagined 2 weeks ago when she'd proposed this practical marriage. Something grabbed the back of her coat. Ethan had climbed into the well. Are you insane? She sputtered. Probably. Can you hold on to me? She wrapped her arms around his neck and he pulled them both toward the rope. His hands found the same loop she'd been grasping, and together they held on while his horse strained above. Slowly, impossibly, they started to rise. Smoke came first, his front legs clearing the edge, then his whole body dragging free in a rush of mud and water. The stallion scrambled away from the well and stood trembling 20 feet off. Then Ethan climbed out, pulling Margaret with him until they both collapsed on solid ground, gasping and shaking. The rain kept falling. Margaret lay on her back, staring at gray sky while her body tried to remember how breathing worked. Her shoulder throbbed where Smoke's hoof had connected. Her hands were torn and bleeding. She was colder than she'd thought it was possible to be. Don't ever do that again, Ethan said beside her. Do what? Fall into a well trying to save a horse. You climbed in after me. That's different. How? He turned his head to look at her. Because I can't lose you, Margaret. Not to a well, not to anything. You understand? She understood. But before she could answer, Smoke walked over and pressed his nose against her muddy hair. The horse that had been wild and terrified 2 months ago stood beside the woman who'd refused to give up on him, even when it nearly killed her. Margaret reached up with shaking hands to touch his face. Stupid horse, she whispered. You're supposed to stay in the barn during storms. Smoke snorted softly, almost like agreement. Ethan sat up with a groan. Can you ride? I think so. Good, because we need to get you inside before you freeze to death. They made it back to the ranch, moving slowly through rain that had finally started to ease. Margaret swayed in the saddle, exhaustion and cold making everything feel distant and strange. Inside, Ethan stripped off her wet clothes with shaking hands and wrapped her in every blanket they owned. He built the fire up until the room was almost too warm and made her drink coffee so hot it burned her tongue. "Your shoulder," he said, noticing the way she winced. "Let me see." The bruise was already forming, dark purple, spreading across her back like spilled ink. "It's fine," she lied. "It's not fine. You got kicked by a horse." "I've had worse." "When?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "When my aunt decided I wasn't working hard enough to earn my keep. She had a cane she liked to use for emphasis." Ethan's expression went very still. "She hit you?" "Only when I disappointed her, which was often." Margaret pulled the blanket tighter. "It's a long time ago. It doesn't matter." "It matters." His voice was rough. "Everything that happened to you matters, Margaret. Every hurt, every person who failed to see how extraordinary you are, all of it matters." She felt tears starting and couldn't stop them. "I almost got us both killed today. You saved Smoke." "I was reckless." "You were brave." "It was stupid. We could have drowned it, but we didn't." He pulled her against his chest carefully, mindful of her injured shoulder. "We didn't because you're stubborn and determined, and you don't give up on things you care about, even when you probably should." Margaret let herself cry against his shirt while he held her and the fire crackled, and somewhere outside Smoke was safe in his stall, probably drying off and wondering what all the fuss had been about. When the tears finally stopped, she pulled back enough to see Ethan's face. "The bank comes in 12 days, she said. "I know. We're going to lose this place." "I know that too." "I don't want to leave." Ethan tucked wet hair behind her ear. "Then we fight. We have 12 days to find a solution, and if we don't find one, we fight anyway. We make them drag us out instead of walking away quietly." "That's not very practical." "I stopped being practical the day I married you." Despite everything, Margaret smiled. "What are we going to do? Right now, you're going to rest and let that shoulder heal. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next step. And after tomorrow? After tomorrow, we keep fighting until we can't fight anymore." He kissed her forehead. "Together." Margaret fell asleep wrapped in blankets in Ethan's arms while the storm finally broke and rain gentled to a whisper against the windows. She woke sometime after dark to find him gone. For a panicked moment she thought he'd left, but then she heard voices from the main room. She wrapped a blanket around herself and limped to the doorway. Ethan was talking to someone. A man she didn't recognize, older, weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "Margaret." Ethan stood when he saw her. "This is Tom Morrison. He owns the spread 15 miles east." Morrison removed his hat. "Ma'am, sorry to intrude at this hour." "Mr. Morrison heard about our situation," Ethan continued carefully. "He rode over to make an offer." Margaret's stomach dropped. "What kind of offer?" Morrison shifted his weight. "I heard the bank's calling in your loans, heard you might be looking to sell before they seize everything." "We're not selling to Wade Colton," Margaret said flatly. "Wasn't suggesting you should. Colton's a snake and everyone knows it." Morrison looked between them. "But I've been wanting to expand my operation and your land borders mine. I could offer you a fair price. Not what it's worth, but better than what the bank will give you." Ethan's jaw was tight. "How much?" Morrison named a figure that was probably fair under the circumstances, but nowhere near enough to cover Ethan's debts. "That's less than half what I owe," Ethan said. "I know. But it's cash, and it's immediate. You could use it to negotiate with the bank, maybe buy yourself more time." Margaret watched Ethan's face as he processed this. Another offer. Another way to lose the ranch while walking away with something instead of nothing. "I need to think about it," Ethan said finally. "Fair enough, but I need an answer by week's end. After that, I'll have to put my capital elsewhere." Morrison headed for the door. "I'm sorry it came to this, Mercer. You're good people. Both of you." After he left, Ethan slumped into a chair. "That's the third offer this week," he said. "Morrison, Colton, and some investor from Laramie I've never heard of. Vultures circling." "Morrison seemed decent." "He is decent, which makes it worse." Ethan rubbed his face. "At least with Colton, I could tell him to go to hell and feel good about it." Margaret sat down across from him. "What do you want to do?" "I want to tell Morrison no and figure out some other way." "But I don't know if there is another way, Margaret. The money's not enough to save the ranch, but it's enough to start over somewhere. Give us a chance at a future instead of just drowning in debt. So we'd leave Wyoming. Maybe. And go where? I don't know. California? Oregon? Somewhere we could build something new. Margaret thought about leaving, about packing up the small life they'd started here and walking away from Red Hollow and the ranch and everything they'd fought for. Part of her wanted it. A fresh start somewhere nobody knew them, somewhere she wasn't the old maid school teacher and Ethan wasn't the failed rancher. But another part of her hated the idea of Wade Colton or some stranger from Laramie taking this land and turning it into just another property. We still have 12 days, she said. To do what? I don't know yet, but I'm not ready to give up. Ethan looked at her with something between hope and exhaustion. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Is that a complaint? It's an observation. He reached across the table for her hand. And a compliment. They sat in silence while the fire burned low, and the impossible math of their situation refused to add up to anything but loss. The next morning, Margaret went to teach despite her bruised shoulder and Ethan's protests. She arrived to find the classroom full of curious stares. News of the storm rescue had already spread through town, probably embellished with each retelling. Is it true you fell in a well, Miss Whitmore? Sarah Chen asked before Margaret could even remove her coat. Mrs. Mercer, Margaret corrected gently. And yes, it's true. And Mr. Mercer climbed in to save you? We saved each other, and the horse. The children absorbed this with the serious attention they gave to all stories involving danger and drama. My pa says you're crazy, Billy Tucker announced. Says no woman should risk her life for a horse. Margaret set her books down carefully. Your father is entitled to his opinion, but sometimes the things worth saving are exactly the things other people think are worthless. She taught the day's lessons with her usual focus, but her mind kept drifting back to the ranch and Ethan and the 12 days they had left. After school, Emma Dorset intercepted her outside. Margaret, I heard about yesterday. How terrifying. It was manageable. Still, you must have been so frightened, trapped in that well with... Emma caught herself. Well, I'm glad you're safe. Margaret knew a setup when she heard one. What do you really want, Mrs. Dorset? Emma's smile thinned. I heard Morrison made you an offer, and that you're considering it. How did you hear that? People talk, dear. They're saying you and Ethan might leave Wyoming, start fresh somewhere else. And I wanted to make sure you know that wouldn't be running away. Sometimes the brave thing is knowing when to accept defeat and move forward with dignity. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. Is there a point to this conversation? I'm trying to help you, Margaret. You've already been through so much humiliation with this situation. If you leave now, you can control the narrative. But if you stay and let the bank seize everything, you'll just be proving what everyone already thinks, that you made a foolish choice marrying Ethan. What everyone thinks doesn't concern me anymore. That's pride talking, and pride won't keep you warm when you're homeless. Margaret stepped closer. You know what, Emma? I spent 20 years carrying what Red Hollow thought of me. 20 years trying to be respectable and appropriate and everything a proper spinster schoolteacher should be. And where did it get me? A rented room and your pity. Emma's face flushed. I never pitied you. You absolutely did. Everyone did. But Ethan doesn't pity me. He sees me as an equal, as a partner. And yes, we might lose the ranch. Yes, we might end up with nothing, but at least we'll have each other and our dignity intact, which is more than I can say for people who measure worth by property and bank balances. She walked away before Emma could respond, her heart pounding but her head high. She had spent too many years being careful, being quiet, being what other people expected. She was done with that version of herself. When Margaret got home, she found Ethan in the barn with papers spread across a barrel, working through numbers that still didn't add up. I've been thinking, she said. He looked up. About Morrison's offer? About all of it. The ranch, the bank, everything. She moved closer. What if we don't sell? Margaret, we've been through this. Hear me out. Morrison's offer doesn't save us. It just delays the inevitable and forces us to leave. But what if instead of running, we stay and fight? Fight how? We don't have the money to pay the bank. No, but we have 12 days to make noise about it, to tell everyone in Red Hollow and beyond exactly what's happening, how the bank is seizing a productive ranch because of one bad investment, how Charles Whitfield destroyed a man's livelihood over wounded pride. Ethan stared at her. You want to make this public? I want to make it embarrassing for Whitfield, for the bank, for everyone who's treating this like just another business transaction. Margaret's voice gained strength. We might still lose. Probably will lose. But at least we'll go down fighting instead of slinking away quietly. You realize this could backfire, could make things worse. How much worse can they get? Ethan considered this. Then slowly, something like a smile started to form. You know what? You're right. If we're going to lose everything anyway, we might as well make them work for it. So we fight? We fight. Margaret felt something fierce and reckless bloom in her chest. They were probably going to fail. Probably going to lose everything and end up exactly where Emma Dorset predicted, homeless and humiliated. But they'd do it together. And somehow that made all the difference. They started the next morning by riding into Red Hollow together. Not to beg, not to plead, just to tell the truth loudly enough that people couldn't pretend they didn't hear it. Margaret stood in the center of town outside Patterson's general store while curious onlookers gathered. Ethan stood beside her, silent support while she found her voice. Most of you know me, Margaret began. Her hands were shaking, but her voice held steady. I've taught your children for 20 years. Some of you have known me since I arrived in Red Hollow, with nothing but a trunk and hope that things might be different here. People shifted uncomfortably. Emma Dorset stood near the back, her expression caught between curiosity and disapproval. 2 weeks ago, the bank decided to call in my husband's loans. Not because the ranch is failing, not because Ethan is irresponsible, but because Charles Whitfield withdrew his investment after Ethan refused to let him treat me like property. A murmur ran through the crowd. Now the bank wants to seize everything. The land, the livestock, the house. They're giving us less than 2 weeks to come up with money we don't have. And when we're gone, men like Wade Colton will buy the ranch for a fraction of its worth and pretend they earned it through hard work instead of predatory opportunism. Wade Colton pushed forward from the crowd. You got no right standing here making accusations. I have every right, Margaret cut him off. I'm telling the truth. You made an offer on our ranch 3 days ago. Less than it's worth, timed perfectly to take advantage of our desperation. Don't pretend that's honest business. Colton's face went red, but he didn't deny it. Margaret turned back to the crowd. I'm not asking for charity. I'm not even asking for help. I just want you all to witness what's happening. When the bank comes, when they take everything, I want you to remember that this could be any of you. One bad deal, one powerful man's wounded pride, and suddenly your life's work belongs to someone else. What do you expect us to do about it? Someone called out. Nothing, Margaret said. Absolutely nothing. Just remember that you stood here and watched it happen. She walked away before anyone could respond, Ethan beside her. Behind them, the crowd remained silent. Whether from shame or indifference, Margaret couldn't tell and didn't care anymore. They'd said their piece. Now they'd see if it mattered. The answer came faster than expected. That evening, Tom Morrison returned with 2 other ranchers Margaret didn't know. Heard what you said in town today, Morrison started without preamble. About the bank and Whitfield and all of it. I meant every word. Figured you did. Morrison glanced at his companions. These are the Garrett brothers. They run cattle north of my spread. We've been talking, and we want to make you a different offer. Ethan crossed his arms. I told you I needed time to think. Not that offer. A new one. Morrison pulled out papers from his coat. We're proposing a partnership. The 3 of us buy into your ranch as investors, not owners. Investors. You keep control of the operation, we provide capital to pay off the bank and keep things running. Margaret felt her breath catch. Why would you do that? Because what Whitfield did was wrong, one of the Garrett brothers said. And because letting the bank seize good land sets a bad precedent for all of us. Today it's you. Tomorrow it could be any rancher who crosses the wrong rich man. There's conditions, Morrison added quickly. You'd owe us repayment over 5 years. We'd want quarterly reports on the ranch's finances. And we'd need assurance that you're running a sound operation. But the land stays ours? Ethan's voice was careful, like he didn't quite believe what he was hearing. The land stays yours. We're not looking to take over. We're looking to make sure Whitfield doesn't win. Ethan looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. Can we see the papers? Margaret asked. They spent 2 hours going through the details while Morrison and the Garretts waited patiently. The terms were fair, more than fair. Interest rates that were almost generous. Repayment schedules that accounted for bad seasons and market fluctuations. Why are you really doing this? Ethan asked finally. Morrison was quiet for a moment. My daughter's a school teacher, over in Laramie. She's 32 and unmarried, and every letter she sends, I can hear how lonely she is, how much the town makes her feel like she's failed at something just by existing. He met Margaret's eyes. What you said today about being invisible for 20 years, my daughter lives that every day. So maybe I'm doing this partly because I wish someone had given her a chance to be seen as something other than a spinster schoolteacher. Ipepos. Margaret felt her throat tighten. And partly, Morrison continued, because watching powerful men destroy good people just because they can makes me sick. So take the offer or don't. But know it's legitimate and it's yours if you want it. Ethan reached for Margaret's hand under the table. Can we have tonight to discuss it? Take all the time you need, within reason. After they left, Margaret and Ethan sat in stunned silence. Is this real? Margaret whispered. I think so. We could actually keep the ranch. We could. Ethan was staring at the papers like they might disappear if he looked away. We'd be in debt to them instead of the bank, but at least we'd have a fighting chance. So we take it? He turned to face her fully. Do you want to take it? Because this ties us here, Margaret. To this ranch, to Wyoming, to all of it. No fresh start in California. No running away from Red Hollow's opinions. Margaret thought about what she'd said in town that morning. About being invisible for 20 years. About watching life happen to other people while she stood on the sidelines. I don't want to run away, she said. I want to stay and build something here, with you. Even if it's hard. Even if people keep talking. Ethan pulled her into his arms. Then we stay. We stay, she agreed. They signed the papers the next morning. The bank was furious. Charles Whitfield, when he heard, sent a blistering letter threatening legal action that his lawyers quietly told him wouldn't hold up. Wade Colton made a scene at the saloon about being cheated out of his rightful claim, but no one was listening anymore. Red Hollow didn't know quite what to make of it all. The old maid schoolteacher and the struggling rancher had somehow pulled off what looked impossible, saving their ranch through sheer stubbornness and the help of neighbors who'd decided that watching predators win wasn't acceptable anymore. But the real change happened slowly, in smaller moments. Margaret returned to teaching with her head higher. When Emma Dorset tried to offer condescending congratulations, Margaret simply thanked her and walked away. No anger, no need to prove anything. Sarah Chen asked if she could visit the ranch sometime to see the horses. Margaret said yes. Other students started asking questions about the ranch, about Margaret's life outside the classroom, about what it was like to almost drown in a well saving a horse. For the first time in 20 years, they saw her as a whole person instead of just their teacher. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. 3 weeks after signing the partnership papers, Margaret was cleaning up after school when she heard a knock at the classroom door. A young woman stood there, travel-worn and uncertain. Mrs. Mercer, I'm Elizabeth Morrison, Tom Morrison's daughter. Margaret recognized the name immediately. From Laramie. Yes, my father wrote to me about what you did, standing up in town, fighting for your ranch. Elizabeth twisted her hands together. I was wondering if we could talk. They sat in the empty classroom while Elizabeth explained. She'd been teaching in Laramie for 10 years. She was good at it. The children liked her. But the loneliness was crushing her, and she didn't know how to keep going. Everyone treats me like I'm waiting, Elizabeth said. Like my whole life is just a pause until some man decides I'm worth marrying, and I'm so tired of it. Margaret understood that exhaustion in her bones. What do you want to do? Margaret asked. I don't know. That's the problem. I don't know if I want to keep teaching or find something else or move somewhere new. I just know I can't keep living like this. Margaret thought about herself 3 months ago, trapped in that same exhaustion, that same sense of waiting for a life that would never start. You don't have to have all the answers, Margaret said carefully. You just have to start making choices for yourself instead of waiting for permission. But what if I make the wrong choice? Then you make another choice, and another one after that. The point isn't being perfect. The point is moving forward instead of standing still. Elizabeth looked at her with something like hope. Is that what you did? Made choices even when they seemed crazy? I proposed marriage to a man I barely knew to escape a life that was suffocating me. So yes, I made what everyone told me was a crazy choice, and it was the best decision I ever made. They talked for another hour. Margaret didn't have easy answers or guarantees, but she listened the way no one had ever listened to her during those 20 lonely years. When Elizabeth finally left, she looked lighter somehow. Margaret locked up the classroom and rode home to the ranch as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. She found Ethan in the corral with Smoke, working through exercises that had become routine. The black stallion moved calmly beneath him, no longer terrified, no longer fighting every moment of connection. "How was town?" Ethan called out. "Interesting. Morrison's daughter came to visit." "The one he mentioned?" "Yes, she's struggling with some of the same things I struggled with." Margaret climbed up on the fence rail. "It's strange being on the other side of that conversation. What did you tell her?" "To stop waiting for permission to live her life." Ethan guided Smoke over to the fence. "Good advice." "I'm learning as I go." He dismounted and stood beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "You know what I've been thinking about?" "What?" "Everything that happened, all the ways this could have gone wrong. If you hadn't helped with Smoke, if I'd accepted Whitfield's terms, if we'd sold to Morrison or Colton instead of fighting." He took her hand. "Any of those choices, and we wouldn't be here right now. We'd be somewhere else." "Somewhere worse," Ethan said firmly, "because wherever it was, we wouldn't be together." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm 26. Ancient." He laughed and pulled her down from the fence into his arms. "Says the woman who's 38 and acts like she's lived 100 years. I feel like I've lived 100 years sometimes." "Yeah, well, you've got at least another 100 to go. I'm not letting you off easy." They stood in the corral while evening settled around them and smoke grazed peacefully nearby, no longer the broken thing everyone had wanted to destroy. 2 months ago, Margaret had been invisible. 1 month ago, she'd been desperate enough to propose marriage to save herself from suffocation. Now she was standing in her own ranch, married to a man who saw her as essential instead of convenient, building a life that was messy and complicated and entirely theirs. "I love you," she said, because the words still felt new enough to be worth saying out loud. "I know," Ethan replied. "You fell into a well for a horse. That's basically a declaration of eternal devotion in ranch terms. I fell into a well trying to save our investment. You fell into a well because you don't give up on things you care about. Horses or husbands, or anything else." Margaret rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, and felt something she'd thought she'd never feel. Peace. Not perfect peace. They still had debts to repay, still had a ranch to run, still had to face Red Hollow's judgment and Wade Colton's resentment and all the small indignities of daily survival. But they had each other. And somehow that made everything else manageable. The spring turned to summer and summer toward fall. The ranch prospered slowly. Not dramatically, but steadily. Cattle prices held. The weather cooperated. Morrison and the Garretts proved to be fair partners who kept their word about not interfering with daily operations. Margaret continued teaching, but she also started helping more with the ranch. Not just with Smoke, but with everything. She had opinions about breeding stock and grazing patterns, and Morrison listened to her with the same respect he gave Ethan. Sarah Chen did visit the ranch, bringing 3 other students with her. Margaret showed them the horses and let them help with feeding. When Sarah asked if she could learn to ride, Margaret said yes and spent the next month teaching her. Other things changed too. Billy Tucker's father came by one afternoon, hat in hands, to apologize for calling Margaret crazy. She accepted the apology without making him grovel. Emma Dorset stopped offering unsolicited advice about Margaret's life choices. Wade Colton kept his distance after Morrison made it clear that anyone causing problems for the Mercers would answer to him. Red Hollow didn't transform overnight into some accepting paradise. People still gossiped, still judged, still had opinions about the practical school teacher who'd married the struggling rancher, but Margaret discovered she didn't care anymore. Their opinions had lost their power over her. One October evening, Margaret was reading by the fire when Ethan came in from checking the livestock. "There's something I want to show you," he said. She followed him outside to the barn where he'd set up a lantern and cleared space in the tack room. "What is this?" "Your office." He gestured around the small space. "I know you've been grading papers at the kitchen table, but I thought maybe you'd like somewhere that's just yours, where you can keep your books and work without me interrupting every 5 minutes. Margaret looked around the space. He'd built shelves along one wall, put in a desk and chair, even found a small stove for heat. "When did you do this?" "Been working on it for a few weeks. Morrison helped with the shelves." She turned to face him and found him watching her with that expression she'd come to know, the one that said he was proud of himself but trying not to show it. "It's perfect," she said. "Yeah?" "Yes." She moved into his arms. "Thank you." They stood in the small space that was now hers, not borrowed, not rented, but actually hers, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. She'd spent her entire adult life trying to make herself small enough to fit into spaces that didn't want her. Now she had a husband who built her space instead. "I have something to tell you," she said against his shoulder. "What?" "I'm pregnant." Ethan went completely still. Then he pulled back to look at her face. "You're sure?" "I've been sure for 2 weeks. I just wasn't sure how to tell you." 2 weeks? Margaret? He stopped, started again. "How do you feel about it?" She'd been asking herself the same question since she'd first suspected. Part of her was terrified. She was 39 years old, which made pregnancy risky. They were still in debt and struggling to keep the ranch profitable. A child would complicate everything. But another part of her, the part that had stopped being afraid of wanting things, was quietly thrilled. "I feel scared," she admitted, "and happy, and worried that I'm too old or we're not ready or 100 other things. But mostly I feel like our life keeps getting bigger and messier and more complicated, and I wouldn't change any of it." Ethan kissed her, softly at first, then with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly what you wanted. "We're going to be terrible at this," he said. "Probably. I don't know anything about babies. Neither do I. But we'll figure it out?" "We'll figure it out," Margaret agreed. They stood in her new office while the lantern cast warm light and the future stretched ahead full of unknowns and possibilities. Margaret had spent 20 years believing her life was over before it started. Turned out it had just been waiting for her to stop asking permission and start choosing what she wanted. The baby was born the following spring during a thunderstorm that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of the day she'd fallen into the well. The labor was hard and long, and there were moments when she genuinely thought she might die. But she didn't. She survived, and the baby survived, and when the doctor finally placed a squalling, furious girl in her arms, Margaret felt something she'd never felt before. Complete. Not because the baby made her whole, she'd been whole already, but because this tiny person represented everything she'd fought for, everything she'd been told she'd never have, everything she'd stopped believing was possible. Ethan stood beside the bed looking terrified and awed in equal measure. "What do we name her?" he asked. Margaret looked at her daughter's scrunched red face and thought about Elizabeth Morrison, who'd visited 3 more times and was now planning to move to Red Hollow to start a women's lending library. She thought about Sarah Chen, who'd learned to ride and had started talking about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday. She thought about every woman she'd known who'd been told they were too old, too plain, too difficult, too much. "Hope," Margaret said. "We'll name her Hope, because that's what this was. Not a happy ending tied up neatly with ribbons, but a continuing story of people who refused to accept the limitations others put on them." 5 years later, Margaret stood in the yard watching her daughter chase chickens while smoke grazed peacefully nearby. Hope was fearless in the way children who'd never been told to be afraid often were. She climbed fences, she helped feed livestock, she asked 1,000 questions and accepted no easy answers. She was exhausting and perfect and entirely herself. The ranch had prospered enough that they'd been able to pay off Morrison and the Garretts 2 years ahead of schedule. Ethan had invested in more livestock, built a second barn, hired 2 permanent hands to help with the work. Margaret still taught, though she'd cut back to 3 days a week. The rest of the time she helped run the ranch and raised Hope and wrote articles about horse training that Eastern newspapers actually published. She'd become someone. Not famous, not wealthy, but respected in a way that felt earned rather than given. Red Hollow had slowly accepted that Margaret Mercer wasn't going to fit into their expectations. Some people still whispered, still judged, but their opinions had lost their teeth. Elizabeth Morrison's lending library had become a gathering place for women who didn't quite fit the town's narrow definitions of acceptable. They met every Tuesday to read and discuss and support each other through the particular loneliness of being different in a small town. Sarah Chen was 15 now and talking seriously about going to veterinary college. Her parents weren't sure about letting a girl pursue such unconventional education. Margaret was helping her build a case for why she should. Things weren't perfect. They never would be. Ethan and Margaret still fought about money and decisions and 1,000 small things. Hope threw tantrums that could wake the dead. The ranch had bad years along with the good ones, but they were building something real, something that belonged to them. One evening, Margaret was putting Hope to bed when her daughter asked the question that had been inevitable. "Mama, why don't you look like the other mamas?" Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "What do you mean?" "You're older. The other kids' mamas are younger." Margaret had known this conversation would come eventually. That's true. I'm older than most mothers with children your age. Why? Because I didn't meet your father until I was 38, and we didn't have you until I was almost 40. Hope processed this with the serious concentration she applied to everything. Were you sad before? When you didn't have Papa and me? Margaret thought about those 20 years. The loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, the slow suffocation of a life that never changed. Yes, she said honestly. I was sad. I felt like I was waiting for my life to start, and it never did. But then it did start. Yes. When I stopped waiting for permission and started making choices for myself, everything changed. What kind of choices? I chose to help a horse everyone said was dangerous. I chose to marry your father even though people said I shouldn't. I chose to keep fighting for this ranch when it would have been easier to give up. Margaret smoothed Hope's hair back. The point is that I stopped letting other people decide what my life should look like. Hope was quiet for a moment, then, I'm glad you made those choices. Me too, sweetheart. Because otherwise you wouldn't have me. Exactly. Hope settled into her blankets, satisfied with this answer. I love you, Mama. I love you too. Margaret left her daughter's room and found Ethan on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. She sat beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. You know what I was thinking about today? He said. What? That day you showed up at the corral, when you made Smoke calm down and everyone stood there staring like you'd performed magic. I remember. I thought you were the strangest woman I'd ever met, difficult and stubborn and completely impractical. And now? Now I think you're still difficult and stubborn and impractical. He kissed the top of her head. And I wouldn't change a single thing about you. Margaret leaned into him and watched the stars emerge one by one. She'd spent 20 years being told she was too much or not enough, too old, too plain, too opinionated, too difficult. She'd spent 20 years trying to make herself smaller to fit into expectations that were never built for someone like her. But somewhere between a terrified horse and a desperate proposal and falling into a well during a storm, she'd stopped shrinking. She'd expanded instead into a wife, a mother, a rancher, a teacher, a woman who wrote articles and raised stubborn daughters and refused to accept limitations. Not because she was perfect, but because she'd finally learned that being imperfect was not only acceptable, it was essential. The world didn't need more women who made themselves small. It needed women who took up space and made noise and refused to apologize for existing. Women who fell into wells saving horses. Women who proposed marriage on their own terms. Women who stood in town squares and told uncomfortable truths. Women who built lives that looked nothing like what they'd been promised, and everything like what they'd earned. Margaret Mercer sat on her porch in the ranch she'd saved, beside the husband who'd chosen to see her when she'd been invisible, with their daughter sleeping safely inside. She was 44 years old, and her life had never been better. Not because it was easy or perfect or anything like the stories she'd read in books, but because it was hers. Completely, messily, beautifully hers. And that was enough.